Hello and welcome back, everyone. It is a lovely weekend afternoon, and I thought, what better afternoon than today's afternoon to learn about levels of consciousness and how you can use the understanding of levels of consciousness to better manifest or understand how manifestation works, at least. I do have some other additional thoughts about a plethora of other things, especially when it comes to the last dimension of consciousness, but I just wanted to share this today as I thought I can make it more tangible for myself. I've been studying this for a while, and if anyone else gains some insight and interest in this, then it's a win-win for everyone. So without further ado, let us get into levels of consciousness. So what are dimensions, especially dimensions of consciousness? I'll be pulling from definitions and ideas from string theory and physics, just because when I was learning about dimensions of consciousness, I'm still a logical person and I want to ground it in an approach and framework that is still pragmatic and understandable and makes logical sense. So I'll be using those definitions. And as a disclaimer, people have said in string theory and physics that there can be up to like 11 or 26 dimensions of reality and perceived reality, at least, and I'm only going to be covering what I've been studying heavily, which is the first and fifth to the fifth dimension. So I'll be taking these theories and just adapting them to interpret them through the lens of consciousness and how you can perceive the dimensions around you. So dimensions are levels and compartmentalized aspects of perceived reality. So just the different layers of the way the world around or the universe around us is constituted, essentially. So we can look at this on a physical level, and then it'll develop more into a conscious level as we go higher up in the dimensions. So if you look at it in a framework of string theory and physics, 0D, which is like this zero dimension, is a single dot extending nowhere, and essentially consciously here there is no thought. There is just one singular dot, singular perceived dot. So then from dimension 0 we stack it infinitely. So when you stack it infinitely, it starts to form a line. So this, in the first dimension, this starts the dimension of length, or the x-axis, as we say. And here consciously there are single thoughts in their individuality and independence, so they aren't muddled with any other thoughts. They, on a conscious level, they exist individually, really. And movement in the first dimension is restricted to pretty much back and forth on that singular line. So again, the dot first perceived in dimension 0, if you can think of it as like on a sheet of paper, that singular dot is now put in an infinite series and it forms a line. In the second dimension, you stack that one dimension line infinitely, and when stacked it can start to create height with the lines, or the y-axis it starts to provide. So now things in the second dimension can intersect, right? So two-dimensional, because they're being stacked, so they can intersect. Consciously, because we're now stacking these 1D lines to create the 2-dimension, on a conscious level, thoughts begin to be able to be connected and associated with their connotations on like duality. So duality is more perceived starts to begin to be perceived in the second dimensions. And what I mean by duality is like thoughts like black and white, heavy and light, off and on can start to merge. Movement in the second dimension can now go more than just back and forth. So because you're getting two-dimensional shapes like a square, for example, you can go back and forth now, or still, and like up and down. In the second dimension, you now have the x-axis and the y-axis physically, and consciously you begin to be able to connect two concepts in their polarities, at least. So once we start stacking those two-dimensional shapes on top of each other infinitely, you start to get into the third dimension, or the 3D, and this is our usual mode of perception. This creates the physical realm in which things are tangible around us, pretty much. So think of it as the two-dimensional square that we got. When we stack a bunch on top of each other, we start to get more dimension, so we start to get depth. So that square, when you add more squares around it and to it, when you stack them on top of each other, it becomes a cube. So this is really where depth comes in the third dimension. Consciously, most of us operate in the 3D realm and being physically grounded in the perception of our immediate physical surroundings. And being in the 3D means you're keenly aware of physical presence, moments, and materialism, at least on a conscious level. The imagination in 3D, the third dimension of consciousness, like, it's much more intricate. Of course, it gets more intricate, especially now that we're not dealing with just like dualities in like as we did in the second dimension. In the third dimension, there's more imagination because there is more depth to the thoughts that you can have. So thoughts are not just in black and white, but we now can go into the third dimension, or the z-axis, and thoughts here can explore between those perceived dualities. So in the 2D we can only see like black and white, but in the 3D we can see the colors in between black and white. There's much more depth within the 3D when it comes to conscious thought. And so movement in the third dimension is much more dynamic, of course. So in the second dimension you could go up and down, left and right, and now in the 3D you can go parallel and through the z-axis in all directions. This is really where movement becomes to get more dynamic. That's why thoughts can become more intricate, because you can explore and have more ways of thinking and modes of thinking on a conscious level. If you take the moments in the third dimensional space and stack them on top of each other infinitely, you enter the fourth dimension of perception. So because the moments we can tangibly perceive in the 3D are stacked infinitely in the fourth dimension, it is often called the dimension for time, the infinite string of moments and physical substances in 3D, all stacked together perceptually, start to create a timeline, or time, stretches of time, an infinite series of time. So if we are really tuned in to the fourth dimension consciously, we can become keenly aware of the passing of time in the present moment, really. So that means at any given moment we can only perceive one moment in time. So that is either a point of time in the past, the current, present, or the future. So you can really only move back and forth on this timeline, just like we did in the first dimension, so the 1D, which is still physical. In the fourth dimension, because this is the first dimension of time, you can only move back and forth. So you can think of it as like reminiscing on a nostalgic memory. So when you're reminiscing on a nostalgic memory, you're not particularly engaged in your present moment. You're in your head recalling the memory, whether it be from the past, and you're really engaged. Like, you're not really aware of where you are physically. You're more in your head about where that memory was taking place, what is playing out, etc., etc. You're not perceiving the present moment. You are consciously back in time in that past moment. Same thing if you are, idealizing or envisioning the future. You're daydreaming. That's why it's called daydreaming, because you're not really existing and perceiving the current moment that is in front of you. You're thinking of a future time. You're envisioning a future time, and you're very submersed in it. So in the 4D, you can only really perceive one moment of time. So that's either your present moment, sometime in the future, or sometime in the past. You cannot be at multiple, like, you're only moving in that direction back and forth, and you can't perceive multitudes of it. So in the 4D, if it is time, we have access to a back and forth movement of the perception of time. So we can recall things from the past, observe things in the present moment, or mentally create or perceive or envision a future instance. If you're developing and trying to gain a lot of insight on different timelines, whether that's your own, any timelines of the people around you, or the universe and the world around us in general. So this is stacking that fourth dimension, and if you can stack that fourth dimension infinitely, that is the fifth dimension. So you're stacking those timelines, and you're placing them on top of each other. That is where the idea of the multiverse essentially comes in the fifth dimension. In the fifth dimension, because you're stacking different timelines from the fourth dimension all together, you can kind of understand that there's different timelines happening all the time instantaneously. So some also say that the 5D is where the construction of reality itself, or the fabric of reality, is really seen for what it is, and that's the dimension in where you can shape everything around you, technically. So in the fifth dimension, there is a connection of the accumulation of everything that there ever was ever. So it can be fully understood, and I think it's called the fabric or the fifth dimension is the fabric of reality, because if you can really perceive all the accumulation of the dimensions till now, it can be manipulated to be able to derive a lot, which, you know, use it for good, please. But in the accumulation of all the dimensions leading up to the fifth dimension, in my interpretation, that would mean that if you're really in tune with the fifth dimension consciously, the idea that, you know, everything is connected and everything perceived as the manifestation of all things accumulated is much more sound. So because it is also the fourth dimension of time stacked infinitely together, you can intuitively understand that there may be multiple and infinite timelines playing out all at once, all the time. So there is no back and forth on a singular timeline like we did in the fourth dimension. There is now parallel, intersecting timelines, and timelines going in every direction, in all directions. But all timelines, past, present, future, and parallel, are occurring at every moment, all the time, with an infinite variation of events occurring. So it's really crazy when you think about the fifth dimension. And then when you understand the fifth dimension even more in depth, you can understand that anything that could ever happen is happening in some alternate form. You just don't have tangible access to it except in the perception of the mind or the consciousness. So this is the most, like, at least from what I've studied so far, this is the highest form of imagination. This dimension entails the highest form of creation that we can perceive so far. So if you think about something that happened and it happened in the mind, then it may very well have happened in an alternate universe. It's almost like tapping into and being able to access that timeline when you imagine something up. So if you can perceive different scenarios beyond like the ego and material self as having happened, in this sense of the fifth dimension, anything in one's imagination can be a form of reality in another timeline and universe. And it is pretty much that imagination and that, you know, idea of some random scenario can really be accessed through 5D perception and consciousness. I think this is where a lot of ideas for like movies, books, etc. can come from, essentially being accessed and in touch, or having access and being in touch with your 5D perception. That is the creation of reality, because from that idea of a scenario, you, like writers of any sort, start to construct a universe for this story. Like if you imagine like Marvel universe or the DCU and all of that, that was a thought, and now it's a whole universe of realities that have been created into movies, which have actually played out in real time for us, like in film and books and all of that. So it is pretty crazy. Like the 5D is where reality can be completely contrived and created. So that was a lot on the dimensions, but I feel like it's extremely important to understand the different dimensions, especially if you're going to be using it for manifesting, which is only a smart portion of the utility that understanding the levels and dimensions of consciousness can have. So going back to the main principal aim of this video and understand how manifestation works, I will add a little bit of food for thought, because learning and developing your consciousness and expanding it never hurt anyone. But when it comes to manifestation, at least when it comes to egocentricity and building an idealized life for yourself and bringing in the things that you want, manifestation can principally be done within or between the 3D, the third dimension, and the fourth dimension of consciousness. I'd also just want to say egocentricity is not always bad. It just means perceiving reality through the lens of our immediate physical flesh and environment and personal experience. If you really understand that the third dimension is a heightened stage of physical development and perception to us as humans, and we do typically operate in the third dimension, so you can see that being really in tune to the 3D realm helps you manipulate the physical space and present moment going around you. So again, the 3D realm is the physical realm. It's the physical world and perception of things. And then the fourth dimension is the realm of time, or the dimension that pertains to time. At least we're assuming so. And then if you can understand that tapping into the fourth dimension means that you can tap into time. In order to tap into the fourth dimension, you should at least do the following to be able to clear your energy to attract things. So go into your past timeline and really understand it well and get intimate with it. Don't be scared of the things that might come up, but actually face your demons. So this is good again for clearing your energy and being better able to handle calamity and reprogram your behaviors and thoughts around certain things that have happened in your past timeline. Stillness in the present flow, healing your past demons are the 2 first steps. This is truly just prepping you to manifest into the 3rd D, but you have to use the 4th D to do some muddling first. And now after you have been able to reprogram the past timeline, be present in the still moment, and be able to detach as you need to, the last step to really taking advantage of the 4th dimension and that level of consciousness is to tap into and envision a future timeline you of what you want to see, and what you want your physical reality to represent, in the coming pending moments. And I mean that in a future reference, like what you want from yourself going into the future. So if you can really envision yourself and imagine yourself submersed in the environment, the person you are embodying, the people and things you want around you, really submerge yourself in that daydream. You're accessing a timeline of the future you is what you're doing when you are going back and forth on that 4-dimensional scale. You're going into the future and really perceiving what you want to bring into your life. So now the trick of manifestation between the 3rd dimension and the 4th dimension is to bring the 4D you in a better timeline and bringing that 4D idea into your 3D physical reality. You're really grounding it back into your 3D so that it is a tangible and physically evident experience. If any of you are fans of Neville Godard, he says this often, but feeling is the secret. When you really tap into that emotion and feeling that you have when you are your highest self, you will attract and magnetize the things that emulate that idealized version of you. But you have to really feel and savor that feeling of what you have when you are your highest self. Once you can ground that feeling you had of the 4D highest self you into your current 3D reality, you will slowly begin to develop and bring in habits and attract the people that will bring you to that envisioned higher self you and move towards the environment that you envisioned as well. So a little bit of a personal anecdote for this is when I was really wanting to improve my French tenfold, I thought, what better way to be able to use French every day, my day-to-day, than to work in a bilingual position. And so like a year ago, no more than a year ago, I was just imagining myself talking to clients in French and just being fully fluent and using it on a day-to-day practical basis through my work. And like three weeks after that, I got a job offer for a bilingual position, and I was like, wow, I have to almost be careful about what I put out and say in the universe, because honestly, if your burning desire is strong enough and you're feeling that and you're emulating that feeling of wanting and being that person who is their idealized version and has the things that your idealized version has, then it will very slowly but surely start magnetizing itself towards you. Like what you're seeking is seeking you, and being conscious and aware of it, and having brought that feeling of the feeling that I had when I was talking and using French so fluently and in a free-flowing way. I really love that feeling of being so proficient in that in a language, and I had the burning desire to use it in a practical sense, particularly, and getting a job that would help me use it day-to-day. That a few weeks later, the opportunity knocked on my doorstep. So it seems pretty simple, but the 4th dimension will help you have access and tap into your idealized vision of future you and bringing it into the 3D and adopting habits, moving towards the environment and attracting certain people will be brought about in the present sooner than you think if you really use and understand the manifestation tips between the 3rd dimension and the 4th dimension really well. Because this whole video is on dimensions of consciousness, but aside from manifestations occurring within the 3D and 4D consciousness, 5D is also a realm of consciousness that interests me so much. Some say we are in the age of 4D beings, and I can understand that a little bit intuitively. If you understand, like, our ancestors were really operating within their 3D, the 3rd dimension, they pretty much beat the living dog shit out of the earth, and I guess we are still doing that now. Still kind of, there is still a lot of us operating in the 3D and trying to physically harness this world. But nowadays I feel like the generation that is coming up are more four-dimensional in their four-dimensional trains and modes of consciousness. And I say this because we are using more information from the past timelines, our ongoing present timelines, with like constant streams of data, and also using those to, you know, predict and analyze potential future situations. So if the fourth dimension of consciousness is concerned with being able to move back and forth on a timeline, then we are really doing that. We have so much data and information from the past that we can recall. We're constantly taking it in the present moment, and then we're using it to, you know, risk analyze what could happen in the future. And manifestation is so big because of that, and I think that is a huge reason why we can say that we are fourth dimensional beings, because we are moving very readily, easily between, you know, past, present, future, moving along the time consciousness dimension. So because we are developing and stacking, you know, the fourth dimension timelines, differing timelines constantly on top of each other with the data that we're pulling with, you know, technology, I think, you know, like I said, stacking that fourth dimension of time infinitely on top of each other, you eventually get to the fifth dimension of consciousness. So as we compile and give the future generation much more information and data for anything that they could ever need, I think that is their starting point to transcend into a higher state of being. So this is where we can start to really alter the fabric of our society and our reality as a collective. I think transcending to the fifth dimension state is necessary to deal with things like climate change, just because we have to understand the connectedness of everything when it comes to our impact on the environment, and how to, you know, change that for the future. And so when I think about the fifth dimension in more kind of latent and, you know, in framework of like cultural pop references, I think of the movie Arrival when I think about the fifth dimension. So in this movie, they teach the scientists how to think of time not linearly, and they need help because in our perception of time, in our future timeline, in how from we perceive it, something bad happens to them. So by teaching her how to speak their language, and it helps her gain an understanding of how they perceive time, she can actually do something in the 3D present moment to help their reality, you know, be saved. That's a really good movie to understand the 5D on a more tangible scale, instead of it being so meta when I talk about it. You really want to get a meta understanding a bit more of how the fifth dimension manifests in a tangible scale, and how language actually, as I've said, I love language for this, it can really frame how you think and perceive everything to be, and even when it comes to time. So watch this movie if you really want to understand the fifth dimension more intuitively. So like, I have no predictions for what will happen in terms of humanity or in the universe in regards to, you know, when we move en masse, at least, towards 5D consciousness, but I do hope it is for the best once we all have access to that level of shared and conscious being. It's just fun to think about, and this topic has interested me so much, so I'm glad that I made it a little bit more tangible for myself and others to understand. So hopefully that interested some of you guys there, that you guys got some value from this, and hope to see you guys in the next video. Bye for now.